Our workshop today will consist of 2 sessions, the first being the keynote speeches and the second being a Q&A session. As you heard from Mr. Tsuchiya, we have 3 experts in the disaster prevention field from the USA and Japan here to speak with us about countermeasures for railways against natural disasters. We have a wide variety of experience from our speakers, and each is an expert in their own field, so we think it will be very informative today. A coffee break will follow the keynote speeches, and then we'll have a Q&A session. There will be time for audience participation in the second half, so we ask that you please hold your questions until that time for the flow of this workshop. Thank you for your cooperation. Without further ado, I am pleased to introduce our first keynote speaker, Mr. Hampton Hart. Mr. Hart became the Deputy Director of the Technological Hazards Division at FEMA in June of 2018. Prior to this position, Mr. Hart was the National Exercise Division's Deputy Director and also the Director for the Office of Training Exercises in Virginia's Department of Emergency Management. In these capacities, he has served to better prepare state and local governments in their emergency management programs. We're grateful that he could be with us today. If you could please join me in welcoming Mr. Hart.
Mr. President, distinguished co-panelists, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Brock Long, the Administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, it's a pleasure to be here today and to address with you what FEMA is doing in the area of preparedness and what we are doing with our whole community partners to maintain plans, processes, and procedures to achieve the national preparedness goal, that of being a secure and resilient nation. The administrator, Mr. Long, likes to describe emergency management and response to a chair with 4 legs: the federal government, state and local government, the private sector and non-governmental organizations, individuals, and communities. When all 4 of those legs go into response and recovery, the chair is stable. Emergency management is a whole community effort, and I personally like to describe it as very much a contact sport. An important lesson from the 2017 Atlantic hurricane storm season is that success is best delivered through a series that is federally supported, state managed, and locally executed. The FEMA 2018-2020 strategic plan seeks to unify and further professionalize emergency management across the nation and invites the whole community to join FEMA in embracing these priorities. We recognize that it will take the entire system working as one through this strategy to help people before, during, and after disasters to achieve our vision of a more prepared and resilient nation. The plan reflects the ideas, suggestions, and perspectives of not only the FEMA staff, but that of our stakeholders, and the many day-to-day conversations with disaster survivors and communities to better gain and understand how we can turn great ideas into reality. As part of the plan's development process, we reached out to our critical state, local, tribal, and territorial partners, along with the nonprofit organizations and private sector, because they are critical in the success of our plan. But this plan, this is just the beginning. It describes a vision that we can all pursue together to build FEMA a better and galvanized emergency management profession. The strategic plan includes three ambitious but achievable goals for the 2018-2022 period. The strategic goals are focused on our FEMA vision, again, of a prepared and resilient nation. The three goals, as you see depicted on the slide, to build a culture of preparedness throughout the nation, to ready the nation to respond to catastrophic disasters, and very important, to reduce what some feels to be the complexity of FEMA. These objectives highlight the meaningful ways in which the organization, FEMA, can focus our workforce, simplify our processes and procedures across FEMA, and provide enhanced stewardship of funds and better engage and support survivors. Following the 2017 season, one of the changes we made to greater coordinate with our partners was the establishment of the Lifelines. Lifelines is the critical sectors that provide indispensable services that enables a continuous operation of critical business and government functions and is critical to human health and safety or economic security. As defined, it's safety and security, food, water, and sheltering, health and medical, emergency, such as power and fuel, communications, transportation, and hazardous waste. Those are those areas where after a significant event are the most impacted, and the things that we must do as decision makers to rapidly determine the scope, the complexity, and the interdependencies of the effects of the disaster. By applying these lifelines, it allows us to prioritize, sequence, and focus response efforts towards restoring and maintaining the most critical services and infrastructure. One of our most important things is to use a common lexicon, plain speak, to ensure that it can, by doing that, it will facilitate unity of effort across all of the stakeholders. It's very important that when we're using terms that they are understood, because if they are not, or if there are assumptions played, we could waste critical resources. What also happens, it promotes response that facilitates unity of purpose to better understand one another amongst the whole community. And it clarifies which components of the disaster are complex or multifaceted and or complicated, difficult, requiring cross-sector coordination. Now, I mentioned our national preparedness goal of a secure and resilient nation. The national preparedness goal was first released in 2011, and it was updated in 2015. But the goal describes the capabilities-based vision for preparedness nationwide. It identifies 32 core capabilities necessary to achieve that vision across all 5 mission areas of protection, prevention, mitigation, response, and recovery. Implementation involves a continuing cycle of activities through the national preparedness system. It's that we identify the risk, we estimate our capabilities to meet those risks, we build and sustain those capabilities, we create plans and execute the planning to deliver those capabilities, and we validate those capabilities through real-world exercises and events that may take place. And then finally, the cycle repeats itself as we review and update our capabilities and our plans. The guidance, the programs, the processes, the system each support one another. They are collaborative, and we utilize the whole community approach. Now, the President spoke in his opening remarks about the 2017 hurricane season, and I wanted to just share some brief statistics or data about that. 2017 was a record-setting year for FEMA. We responded to incidences on the East Coast with Hurricane Florence, Hurricane Michael, and the West Coast. There were three Category 4 landfall hurricanes in 2017. We had 59 major disaster declarations, $9.6 billion in flood insurance claims. 47 million Americans were affected by the disaster, almost 15% of the population. By the end of 2017, more than 4.7 million survivors registered for individual assistance. And we, the federal government, had more than 20,000 personnel involved in the response. Some of the lessons learned from our previous disasters and from our after-action reports that we conducted, we had 18 major findings across 5 focus areas. But among some of the most significant lessons learned was that of our surge capacity force and our staffing. Those disasters in 2017 stretched the FEMA's resources and the entire federal government. We bent, we didn't break. To the greater extent than any previous disaster, the decisions regarding personnel and commodities made the support in one incident that had the potential to significantly impact the follow-on disaster operations. Keep in mind that when Maria hit in 2017, we had already had significant recovery operations underway for Harvey in Texas, for Irma in Florida and Puerto Rico, and in the Virgin Islands. FEMA and our federal partners responded rapidly. We surged to provide more resources. We instituted what we call the Surge Capacity Force. The Surge Capacity Force is made up of federal employees from every department and agency in the federal government. For the first time since 2012, when we deployed on Hurricane Sandy, more than 1,100 non-FEMA personnel deployed to New York and New Jersey. In 2017, in response to Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, we had more than 2,700 individuals from 8 DHS components deployed, and the Surge Capacity Force, made up of individuals from the 34 other federal departments and agencies, we were able to deploy an additional 1,300 personnel. I've spoken briefly about 2017, and the statistics are shown, but just last week with the with the earthquake in Alaska, we have other real-world threats that we are focusing on. Those threats are ever present, but such as that of earthquakes. We are familiar with the San Andreas fault lines in the Cascadia subduction zone, and also within the middle of the United States, the New Madrid seismic zone. There are 8 states that are involved in there. The New Madrid zone runs southwest from New Madrid, Missouri. The 8 states involved are Alabama, Arkansas, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Mississippi, Missouri, and Tennessee. The Central United States Earthquake Consortium serves as a coordinating body to assist us in the planning for such an event. And as you could imagine, an earthquake in the United States in that zone, in that seismic zone, would sever the nation, would cut the nation in half almost. This is a snapshot of 2018. While we have not, the year is not over yet, and of course, at the end of the year, we will do our after-action report to look for the lessons learned during this time. But again, in 2017, today, we are managing some 16 joint field offices. We're currently managing some 48 disasters in 32 states. We have 3 fire management assistance grants that's in effect. And just to give you an idea in terms of the size of commodities, as you can see noted on the slide, almost 115 million liters of water and 72 million meals having been provided as a result of the disasters this year alone. Now, one of the most important aspects is working with our state and local partners is that we have developed a national risk and capability assessment. And as a nation, we are getting an idea of where we stand with regards to our ability to provide the requisite capabilities in the right amounts at the right time in the event of a disaster. But this assessment is comprised, as noted here, of reviews from our state and local partners, and we attempt to answer those 5 questions that you see to the right of the slide. To be able to exactly, for a community to determine where they stand in preparedness, they ask the questions as noted here. What is it that we need to do to prepare? What level of capability do we need to be prepared? What are our current capabilities? Then we look at the gap between what we or the shortfall of what we currently have and what we need. And then we go about attempting how are we going to address those shortfalls. That assessment is very important because it goes to further inform decision-making at a critical time. Next, that is summarized as part of annual, we have produced 7 national preparedness reports. It's an annual report that goes to the White House, and you can see by depicted from this slide, the data is assembled from over 500 sources, including, again, the threat and hazards and identification and risk analysis, and the state preparedness reports. And it provides, as noted here, practical insights in preparing to support decisions and programs, priorities, resource allocations, and community actions. In this year's report, it highlights the areas in which the nation has reported back the local communities what they believe to be their most proficient in, and they're identified on this slide. And also, it shows 5 areas that continue to be a challenge for us. As looking at the slide, if everyone can see it, you'll notice that operational coordination is on there, both as one identified as being proficient in, but then you also see it in an area where there's persistent challenges. That comes from what we observed in 2017. To be able to manage multiple disasters at the same time, while we had prepared, just the enormity of that event, there was some stressing in the system. So it was identified. We were okay, but we could get better. Okay. In my comments also, I talked about the role of individuals and communities. It's very important for every individual to make a plan, prepare a kit, and stay informed. To share a story with you from the most recent fires in California, an 85-year-old resident was able to take the necessary actions during the disaster, and she credits her local emergency management officials. She stated that through the training and information that she had received, she was able to make a plan. She took and identified her valuable items, was able to collect all of those. And when the word came from her emergency management officials to evacuate, she was ready, and she did. and she credited that for saving her life. That kind of engagement is what is the expectations of all of our citizens to all those to be ready, to be prepared. But this slide highlights one of the most activities that we have is America's Prepareathon, which many of you may have participated. Associated with our earthquake drill, we have I don't know how many participate in the shakeout, the Great American Shakeout exercise. But it's one where annually individuals have the opportunity to participate at the local level, work through the actions if they were impacted by an earthquake, the kinds of things that they would do. But the 2016 household survey results highlight strong positive relationships between individuals that report receiving relevant hazard information and those taking actions to prepare. 91% of the adults reporting in 2016 that positive trends in individuals taking at least one of the identified preparedness activities, and additionally, the survey results indicated that a number of individuals were able to obtain supplies for 3 days. If there were an event that they had enough supplies for 3 days, that was over 75% of individuals being able to achieve that. Now, directly related to our topic, I would like to highlight one thing we did in the area of rail safety. In 2015, as a result of the concern of the transport of highly volatile oils, FEMA embarked upon a training session out with local communities. We went to both a major metropolitan area, a rural community, and a tribal community to work with them, to assess them on their ability to respond to such an event. And the take home from that was we developed a series of exercises that community could pull down from our website, and they could participate in the training on their own. They could conduct their own exercises, tailoring it specifically to their needs. These were the objectives for that exercise series. It was to provide one of the big significant notes was to provide a situational awareness or an appreciation of the risk and an understanding of that risk. And here are some of the lessons learned. Just to highlight one, that one of the most important things was to better integrate existing and emerging information on the vulnerabilities and the capabilities that was associated and the planning to manage such an event. Oops. And finally, as a shameless plug for what I do every day, as the Deputy Director of the Technological Hazards Division, we are responsible for assisting the local communities in building the core capabilities in the 500 communities that live in the emergency planning zones in and around our 60 nuclear power plants and our 2 chemical stockpile demilitarization sites. We provide assistance as they develop their programs, their processes, their procedures. We annually test them in each year for them to assess their capabilities and to perfect their readiness. With that, I would again like to thank all of you for the opportunity to be present today, and I look forward to your questions at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. I'd now like to introduce our second keynote speaker, Mr. Bill Douglas. Mr. Douglas is a senior risk analyst at the Los Angeles County Metro. With over 30 years of experience in risk management, Mr. Douglas holds several designations in risk and insurance, including Associate in Risk Management for Public Entities. In addition to writing to several white papers, including those in rail, Mr. Douglas continues to serve the public by holding mentoring workshops for young professionals in the transportation field. We're very grateful he was able to join us here today, and if you could please join me in welcoming Mr. Douglas. Thank you.
Thank you, Mamiko, and thank you, Mr. President, and also to JITI for inviting me to participate in this workshop today. When you said 30 years in the profession, the first thing that came to mind is I can't be that old, but I am glad to be here with you. I represent Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority. Our current CEO is Philip A. Washington, who has been with us for about the past 3 or 4 years, and he's really been the leader that's helped usher in a dynamic season of growth. I report directly to the Chief Risk Officer, who is Gregory Kildare, who is also applying various innovative approaches to risk and assessment as we go about carrying out the mission of providing transportation to the Los Angeles region. Today I'm going to really take a look at a few areas. One, I'm going to briefly go over the history of LACMTA and then get into some of the exposures that we have. But I think it's really important to share at the beginning where we came from and how we wound up where we are today. LACMTA really is a result of several transportation organizations that were formed back in the 1800s. We started out with an extensive rail, trolley, transportation network, and it was really, I'd like to say, one of the envies of this nation. We really, Los Angeles was just a basin. It was really being developed. And one of the things we did was we needed transportation to get around. The roadways weren't really established. And the peak of the development occurred around World War II. And in World War II, we had several different lines, and you'll see the information contained on the slides here. And we had a peak ridership, and it really served the region well. Our rail system during that time was about 25% larger than what was in New York at that time. This is a map, and it shows the extent of our rail system. If you'll take a look here, you'll see it covers, and if any of you are familiar with the Los Angeles region, it's a huge basin, and so we had rail that went to pretty much every corner of the region. And that was the primary mode of transportation. What led to the growth of it was everything from just sprawl. People just wanted to get out and experience the area, and that's what occurred. It began to decline in the 1950s, and there were several reasons for this, and some of them were the rise of the automobile, obviously. Transportation really and also the oil companies really, some would say, call it the Roger Rabbitization of transportation, because they really wanted to get a foothold in Southern California region. And also individuals, when they were returning from war after World War II, really wanted to just there was this sense of individualism, and rail just really didn't allow for individuals to get to where they wanted to go as quickly as they did. And the last thing was the infrastructure was starting to age, and there's a cost associated with that, which meant the public or else private industry was going to have to pony up to ensure that we maintain the level. A couple of things happened, though, at that time, and that was individuals really, instead of wanting to invest in maintaining public transportation, they really focused more on the individualism. So why pay for public transportation when you can have a car and you can have transportation at relatively cheap prices and get to where you want to go when you wanted to go there? That was fine for a while, but then something happened in the late 70s. Most of you in this room are too young to remember what happened in about 78 and 79, but we had oil embargoes, and we had fuel costs, and we had long lines and so on. All of this created interest in reviving public transportation in the Los Angeles area. But we had to start from scratch. So if you take a look at the map that I showed you a moment ago, we had extensive railways. Well, by 1963, there was none. There was absolutely no rail other than a couple of Amtrak trains that came into the Los Angeles region. And all of this continued until the early 90s. The public outcry, just because we needed public transportation, we needed something that was going to help defray the costs, especially with the lack of certainty in fuel availability. So we voted taxation to build first light rail, which was our blue line from Los Angeles to Long Beach, and also the beginnings of our subway system that we have today. Simultaneously, what occurred was through state legislature, a couple of existing transportation organizations were combined. You'll see here the Metropolitan Transportation Association and also Authority, and also Rapid Transit District were combined, and it formed what we call Metro, or Los Angeles County Transportation Authority, that we have today. It came at a good time because we needed something that could really shepherd in all of these various processes together. Metro is responsible for doing a couple of things. One, we oversee bus networks, and we also oversee transportation. But we also serve as a pass-through, if you will, for certain types of subsidies for roadway development. We work with Caltrans. We fund a lot of the freeway infrastructure that continues to this day in Los Angeles. We have approximately 10,000 employees, and that figure will be significant as I continue this discussion. Our revenue is about $6.6 billion. We have bus routes about 165. I don't have the number here, but I believe currently we have about 2,700 buses on the roadway. We have a green fleet. We don't use diesel anymore. It's all about compressed natural gas. We have a current initiative to transfer all of our operations to zero emission buses within the next, I believe, 10 years. So it's fairly aggressive what we're doing. We have currently 4 light rail lines and 2 subway lines. And our annual rail ridership is about 9.5 million, with a total annual of about 34 million. What you see on your screen now is the current map of our rail lines in Metro. Now, bear in mind, if you just go back about 25 years ago, none of this existed. The only exception would be if you'll take a look here. This area here in the orange is not actually a rail line. It's a busway that functions as a rail line. It's the orange line. And what's really interesting about that is we ran out of funding, and we wanted to serve that part of the community. And what's interesting about it is that is one of our most popular lines. So what you'll probably see occur within the next, well, we're already laid the groundwork for it, and that is to convert it from a busway to an actual rail line. But again, funding is an issue. We've been really fortunate in that the public continues to support transportation. Some are surprised, but we've had a couple of ballot initiatives where we asked the public to agree to additional taxation in order to support the continued development of rail. So those would be in the forms of measures R and M. Some of these are quarter or half-cent sales tax, and the public, and it had to be passed by a 2/3 majority, agreed. So that shows you that there's a hunger for this type of development in Southern California. So as a result, we've embarked on a campaign. We call it the 28 by 28 campaign. And the reason the year 28 is Los Angeles, as you probably are aware, is preparing for the 2028 Olympics. And so we have a lot of infrastructure in place, but we wanted to get certain aspects of it completed so we're ready for the influx of people. The last time we hosted the Olympics was in 1984, and I believe before that was 1932. So 32 we had the rail, in 84 we made it happen, in 2028. Those that are happening right now, and I'll read them off to you, the Crenshaw LAX line, it's almost completed. It will be done in about a year or so. The regional connector, that's going to tie a lot of the existing ones together so you don't have to transfer. It'll be one-seat ride. The Purple Line extension, that's an extension of our subway. That really was part of the plan back in the 90s, but due to gas, and also there was a gas explosion that really wasn't related to construction, but there became a concern that methane gas below ground could erupt and kill a lot of people, especially. And if any of you are involved in the transportation industry, one of the things we constantly have to look out for are the NIMBYs, or not in my backyard. So individuals who will fight tooth and nail. And it's been my experience that once you have this infrastructure completed, they're the ones that embrace it the most. So you just have to really stand firm. And then Purple Line Extension Section 2 and Section 3, we're building it in sections in order to have it done. And the goal, again, is to have it all completed. 2026 is the date that we're really shooting for, but definitely by 2028, so we can take advantage of having it available for the public for the upcoming Olympics. This is a map of what our rail line will look like when we're done. There are a couple of other areas, and I will show you here so I don't mess it up. Okay, here we go. Right here, you see, again, this is the orange line. We haven't converted it yet, but this is, all of this in this area is going to be the extension of the subway. It was all called Subway to the Sea, but that term has been dropped. It's just been called Purple Line Extension. And right here is going to be the Crenshaw line that's going to go to LAX and all the way down. Here you take a look at existing railway. It's going to extend all the way down into the eastern part of Los Angeles County, heading towards the south. And then over here is what's called the Foothill. And Foothill is heading to the east up in the mountains. So that's quite a bit of growth that's occurring in over a relatively short period of time. That's the good news for our agency, because if you take a look at some of the other systems around the country, New York, for example, Chicago, they have quite some age. The good news, bad news about us ending our rail systems in the 1960s is we lost it. You know, it would have been great if we could have maintained such an extensive system up in the present day. Imagine what it would be like. But the good news is we get to start from scratch, and we get to incorporate some of the latest technologies. So that's a bit of who we are, and which I'd like to transition at this point into, once you build it, you have to maintain it. You have to take a look at it. One of our oldest lines that we developed approximately 25, 27 years ago was the Blue Line. And at that time, let's say it cost $1.2 billion to build it. Well, we're at a stage now where we have to do a couple of things. One, we have to take a look at some of the technologies that we incorporated. If you go to some cities, they have more of an appetite for street running or at-grade running. In California, not so much. We are big on grade separation. The public outcry demands it. We have to have certain types of protections at crossings and so on. So what we're doing right now is we're taking a look at that, and we're redesigning certain crossings and so on, and all of that is additional cost. If you really add it up, it isn't quite as much as it cost to build it originally, but it's pretty close. And even if we didn't have those issues about incorporating new technology, just to maintain it, again, is a fairly expensive proposition. We document all of our procedures, especially with regard to risk exposures and employee empowerment. And again, this goes back to the 10,000 employees that we have at Metro with regard to risk and disaster communications. Our exposures are as follows. We have a flood exposure. It's not as big as you would say along the Gulf Coast or even the Eastern Seaboard, or even some other places like Hawaii would have it, Japan has it, or Indonesia. However, we do have a flood exposure, and part of that is because Los Angeles is a basin. It primarily is arid land. And so whenever we have certain type of water events, it tends to impact us much more than it would in some of the areas that are built to handle certain type of water or flood exposures. Our biggest exposure that's been highlighted in the news lately is fire. Southern California, again, being an arid land. We have lots of forest in the areas. It's been fairly dry. We have these seasons where we have El Nino, where there's water, and or La Nina, and where it really gets dry. And we've been going through a really dry spell, and it's evidenced by whenever we have just a spark, and it sets everything off. And we've just recently had an incident, even at some of our facilities. And another one that we're constantly concerned about and we're preparing for now, especially with regard to the Olympics coming on board, is terrorism threat and public safety, because in Los Angeles County we have a big issue with regard to homelessness, and it really isn't just a Los Angeles problem, although we're considered one of the capitals of that, especially if you've been to Los Angeles and happen to visit what we call our Skid Row section. Well, these are citizens, and they avail themselves of our services, and we have to be aware of that. And not only that, how do you differentiate those who are homelessness with mental illnesses with those who may have some type of negative intent? We really have to be aware of that as we go on. And then infrastructure integrity, which goes back to what we're dealing with now with regard to the blue line. I show you this map, and it's just two maps. This is a 2007 map and also 2010. And this is showing just the flood risk that you have. If you take a look at the 2007 map, what it shows here in the graded area here is like below average flood risk. This is in 2007. And then the average is in the center and so on, and then above average in certain areas in the center of the country. Now, in 2010, if you again take a look at well, I'll just talk about it. If you take a look above here, below average is 2010, and then here average in the white areas, and then above average along the eastern seaboard. That was in 2010. What we've observed is that it's changed even since then. This is 2018. Take a look at some of the storms that have occurred since then. I originate from the Gulf Coast of Texas. That's where I was born and raised before I moved to California. I've lived in California for approximately the past 30 years. And growing up in a small town, my hometown is Port Arthur, Texas, I happened to go through several hurricanes. And they were big events, and you had, you knew it was coming, and technology helped to increase the awareness of what the impact would be and so on. But what's happened over the past couple of years is different. You take a look at Harvey and some of these storms, not only do they come, but they stay. They hang and they create these situations, where they just hang on for a while, and it just really devastates the infrastructure. So that's one of the things that you have to take a look at. I am a risk professional. I've dealt with commercial insurance or risk management side of things, as was mentioned, for about the past 30 years. And there are a couple of ways to take a look at risk. There are those that want to quantify it. They want to take a look and put up the spreadsheets and apply a formulaic approach to risk. And that is good, and it is appropriate. But my approach is a little different. I like to measure what's occurring, not just in the region, but globally. And also, there are many lessons to learn from others who have had similar experiences. So what we do is we take a look at that. We have writing procedures written up for all sorts of incidents. We drill. We practice everything that we do, and we empower personnel so they can make decisions. One of the things that we found is sometimes, especially when you're dealing with a bureaucratic organization, is individuals are afraid to either speak out because they see a particular type of exposure, or they're afraid to act because they may get in trouble. Well, that's not good, because if they have information that can really help you, they need to feel empowered, at least to be heard. At least to be heard without retribution. And that's an issue not just in public agencies, but in the private industry as well. We encourage it. I encourage it. Whenever I'm seated in a room with a team of individuals, I always want to hear from everyone, even if it's an idea that I think is half-baked or a little bit crazy. I like to hear it, because you just never know. And I really like to hear from the person that's sitting in the back and being really quiet, because they usually have something to say. And forgive me for framing this the way I'm going to frame it. Sometimes I find that women, will sit back and they'll be quiet. They won't say as much. Others who don't feel empowered to do so will tend to be quiet. But you'll find that they're the ones who really are observant. They really are the ones that can help guide things. So I think it's important that everyone, regardless of background, or has an opportunity to speak. And then we establish emergency communications procedures. This is something that we drill into everyone constantly. Now, take a look at this map here. This is a map of Southern California. As I mentioned earlier, Southern California is a big bowl. We have the mountains that ring it, and then they go to the ocean, everything fills in. What you see here is just how our various systems could be impacted. The darker colored areas are where the flood risk is greatest. Again, we don't have traditional flood exposures like we do have a hurricane risk, but the chances of a hurricane making it up north from Mexico are remote. Our biggest flood exposure is when we have rains, when we have a El Nino year, which it's been forecasted we may. So the waters will collect. They'll flow down out of the mountains, and then it will gather in certain areas. The good news about a rail transportation or even bus is, and some of this applies to some exposures that I'm going to touch upon in just a moment, is disbursement. And how that helps us is we have a rail facility here, we have one here, we have one up here. So if we see an exposure and we're able to address it, we can move things around. You can move rolling stock around. You can't move the real property or the buildings around, and you just have to deal with that. But as I'll talk about in just a moment, with regard to New Orleans and the experience that I had there. So what's forecast to happen because of climate change? You know, we've moved away from the term global warming, is the sea levels are rising. And I pay attention to that. I'm not in the Gulf Coast, although I originate from that region, but it's interesting to see how all of that could possibly impact us. And so you have to prepare for that. You have to take a look at scenarios. These are things you can't necessarily quantify. And the same thing is true as I'll talk about earthquake in just a moment. So we have to take a look at, we invite other organizations to participate with us, and this would be everything from insurance agencies, our insurance carriers, because they will have information that we can utilize. Some people don't want these outside entities in. We invite them in so that they can be with us. Same thing is true with fire. With regard to fire, one of our divisions recently, the fires actually leapt right up, and we had to move all of our equipment out. Fortunately, through airdrops, water drops, we were able to save the facility. But this is a fact of life. That had never happened. But because of procedures that we had in place, the division manager knew exactly what to do and implemented it. Earthquake notification. For this, our rail system, we have sensors that are embedded in the track. There are various systems that are being tested right now to give early notification. The truth is, it's an imperfect science. We get some notice, and even then, it depends on proximity. If it's directly underneath the train, well, you won't get much of a warning. And what we saw in certain areas, like with regard to well, let's just take Alaska, what's just occurred. Alaska has a different type of fault system than we have in Southern California. They have a subduction fault, we have slip fault, and so substrike. And the thing about that is, allegedly, the max Richter scale we'll have is approximately a 7, where it will be much higher in the Pacific Northwest. However, if you take a look at what occurred in Japan just a few years ago near the Fukushima area, it was once believed that the max earthquake occurrence that you could have would be about maybe a 7 or an 8 and so on. But what they found is that that's not necessarily the case. So that's one of the things we take a look at in Southern California. Again, with this, we stop the train and so on. And the drivers know what they need to do. One of the last things we do is we'll notify individuals on the train, because really you need to stop the equipment first and check for safety. People on board will know what's going on. I want to talk a little bit about communications. We have what's called the Emergency Operations Center and also mobile emergency operations. In the event of any type of disaster situation, we have to notify, we need communication. So we do this, and I'll just show you. We start with we have our own robust emergency operations center, and we go to the municipal, in this case Los Angeles, and then the county, and then the state, and of course ultimately coordinating with national authorities so we can maintain this communication. There's another thing that we do, and I mentioned 10,000 employees. We have, and I'm going to spend 1 minute talking about the last thing, I'll wrap up. We have 10,000 employees. All of the employees at Metro agree to serve. As a matter of fact, it is required that we serve as the disaster service workers. So if there is an emergency situation, all of us are notified either through text, email, phone calls, some of us multiple. We just tested it out recently. We usually test it twice a year. We are required by the state in order to serve as disaster service workers if anything occurs. We have numbers where we're supposed to call and report, and we are to help assist. We don't lead it, but depending on what the circumstances are, we are required to respond. And we drill that into everyone's head, and everyone really pretty much understands and accepts that responsibility. Of course, your first area of responsibility would be to your family, but other than that, you are required to report in the event of an emergency situation. The last thing I'll go over briefly, and that is this. What do you do in the event of any type of activity? And there are a couple of things. One, insurance. You take a look at that. The other thing you do is insurance could be in the form of super excess, which forms a major layer, especially if it's a catastrophic event and so on. But some things are uninsurable, especially a major earthquake event in Southern California when you have $12 billion worth of property, which we currently have. So we've worked with FEMA in the past. I believe it was the Northridge earthquake where one of our tunnels, not our subway tunnels, in case you come there, don't worry, the integrity is great, but one of our tunnels had water damage issues, and FEMA stepped in and helped us. One of the rules of the Stafford Act, if you're familiar with that, is once they help, you have to make sure that it is insured, or else they possibly won't step in again. What you have to do is demonstrate that it is commercially unavailable, which we've done. And I encourage any of you, if you're working with these type of entities, we work with our state emergency centers, with FEMA, and we've obtained exemptions. So in the unlikely event, hopefully, that this occurs again, FEMA will step in and assist us again. And we've been able to demonstrate to them that we've done our best, so we aren't just trying to take advantage of the government. Lastly, we constantly take a look at our exposures, and that would be everything from natural exposures, and that would be earthquake and flood and this type of thing. We also have the human exposures, and that would be the issue of homelessness that is occurring, and also the potential for terrorism, which is always ever present. And I believe I personally would like to have more communications with Japan as they're preparing for the games in Tokyo in 2020, just so we can exchange information. As a matter of fact, they had a contingent that recently came to us because we're looking at equipment called Through Vision, if you haven't heard of that, where it can really take a look through clothing and detect these potential bombs and that type of thing, because you need that, especially when you're dealing with a large-scale number of people. Think outside the box. If you just look at what you do every day, you'll get what you always got. You have to think ahead. That's what we try to do, is think ahead what could possibly happen, even if it seems outrageous, and establish clear communications. Empower your people. Let them know that they do have a voice and they are a partner in whatever it is that you're doing. In that way, you'll have to mitigate some of the exposures and maybe come up with some innovative approaches to deal with risk exposures. And then the last couple of things: drill, drill, drill. Always drill, always drill, always test it out, and obtain feedback on what works, and also incorporate partners. Partners would be the city, the state, municipalities, and in our case, we contract with outside engineers and our insurance carriers, because they want to ensure that their money is a safe bet. That's all I got. Again, thank you so much for allowing me to speak before you today, and I look forward to any questions you may have later.
Thank you, Mr. Douglas. I'd now like to introduce our third and final keynote speaker for the session, Mr. Takeshi Kawagoe. Dr. Kawagoe has been the Senior Chief Researcher and Laboratory Head of Geology in the Disaster Prevention Technology Division at the Railway Technical Research Institute. Along with conducting investigations on the causes of railway disasters, he also predicts potential dangers at the site of new railway lines. Prior to his current position, Dr. Kawagoe served as a geologist and civil engineer on large-scale public work projects. We're very grateful that he was able to travel here to join us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kawagoe.
Thank you, Kim-san. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kawagoe Takeshi, Railway Technical Research Institute in Japan. Today, I would like to talk to you about natural disaster evaluation of railways in Japan. Focus on heavy rail disaster. But my English is not that good, so please allow to me that my today's speech will be in English. Sorry. じゃあここから日本語でお話をさせていただきます。
So I'd like to speak in Japanese from here on. Today's agenda is shown here, so I'd like to talk about 5 things. The first one is to discuss or introduce my institution. Second, I'd like to talk about relating to the other presentations. I'd like to discuss some of the features or typical disasters in Japan, and I'll be focusing on Japanese rail systems. And so first, we'd like to understand what kind of environmental features we have in Japan. Third one is recent major natural disasters in Japan, especially in the last decade. And so I'd like to talk about the history, especially about the last 10 years. And then there were many heavy rains. And so I'd like to talk about mainly about countermeasures against heavy rains and also disasters that may happen from heavy rains. And so some of the speakers already talked about climate change, and I completely agree with them because there are some changes in weather patterns in Japan, and we will be seeing more heavy rains in Japan. And that's and also, the United Nations released some of the reports regarding climate change. They alarm about climate change risks to the entire world, and so we cannot ignore those risks in Japan. So I'd like to discuss those aspects. First, this is an introduction to my research institute, RTRI. I'm sorry to excuse me, so it was a little bit difficult to see from my point of view. So let's move on. So in Japan, the first railway line opened in 1872. The length was only 29 kilometers. This was particularly in Tokyo, that connected to Shinagawa. And our institute, which was called Railway Technical Research Institute, the entire railway was actually owned by the Japanese government, and so our organization was found as the part of the Japanese government. However, 1986, all the Japanese railway system was privatized and then divided into 4 JR companies. And there are many private rail lines. However, our organization was also reorganized as a non-profit public foundation as RTRI. This is our organization chart. Oh, let's go back one more slide. So our organization is a research institute But we do not specifically work with the JR railway companies, but we do work with all the railway stakeholders. For example, vendors who produce signals, and also customer organizations, and then also vendors who produce train cars. And so there are some initiatives to standardize procedures. And so for those initiatives, we work with JR companies and also all stakeholders. Let's see the organization chart here. And of course, we do have the chairman and also the president who represents our activities. However, we divided it into 12 R&D divisions. And my division is specifically looking at seismic activities and also disaster prevention technology in relation to railway technology. And so let's talk about Japan's features. I'm sorry about the yellow highlight because I wanted to show this for as a closed information, not for disclosure or distribution. I wish I could delete this yellow highlight, but please do not take a picture. This is only for information only purposes. However, let's move on to our features here. Japan is in a close proximity to a continent and also an island country that lies south to north between the Sea of Japan and the Pacific Ocean. 70% of the land is mountainous, and then there's a feature that rivers run really rapidly to make low valleys. And then also we have about 120 million people, which is a very high population density in the small land mass. And also development is very active. And it is very difficult to see, but there are some weather fronts that bring typhoons during summertime, and then also westerlies that bring snowfalls during wintertime. So these are meteorological features, and due to these features, erosion, soil movements, and also sediments often occur. Based on this information, I'd like to talk about typical natural disasters, especially impacting railway systems. And some of the seismic activities negatively impact constructed buildings. And also we have weathered bedrock, and also causing mudslides, and also earthquakes, gusty winds, and also local winds. During winter time, we see some of the mudslides or icy conditions for train operations. And next one shows our major disasters in the last decade. If you would divide into major categories, we had some volcano eruptions, but they did not impact railway systems. So I am only talking about earthquakes and rain for this discussion. And so you can see some heavy rains, for example, and also earthquakes. For example, inland earthquakes such as 2008 Iwate, Miyagi, and also 2018 Kumamoto. And also in 2011, there was an interplate earthquake known as the Tohoku earthquake that caused a huge tsunami. But for 2011, we have an early earthquake warning system. By taking advantage of the system, we were able to stop all the operating fleet safely and also prior to the earthquake. So I'll be showing some of the pictures later on. So I wanted to show you the gist of the major disasters in the last decade. And in Osaka and also Hokkaido, we experienced some major localized earthquakes. And if you can see the vertical line here, you can track onto every year, meaning that we have some kind of major disaster almost every year. And also, we have a seasonal rain front that brings a rainy season to Japan. And also, we have a Pacific high that may impact our weather significantly. And so we have seen many heavy rain disasters. I'll be sharing some examples later on. And for example, there was a heavy rain that stopped the entire railway systems and also bus routes in the west side of Japan that negatively impacted distribution lines in Japan. Let's move on to the next slide. And so this is one example of an earthquake, 2016 Kumamoto earthquake. You can see the epicenter in the very red portion, and that expanded to Kumamoto area entirely. And so we saw some private lines running near this area. So the center picture at the top, you can see the warped track because this is right above the active fault line when this earthquake occurred. And you can see some of the pictures deformed bridge members because the mountains around the system was shaken so badly. The bridge was basically squashed into the middle. And you can see the right hand side, this one is a tunnel. This is actually 100 years old, and you can still go through inside. And then there's a lining that would reinforce the internal wall. And then so this tunnel was actually shifted so significantly, but it did not collapse inside. And I'd like to show you the next one, which is a heavy rain. And so this was in Kinugawa River flood walls. And this localized water focused on the upstream of the Kinugawa River, and then that actually breached the levees downstream. And you can see this example, July this year. This was another heavy rain happens. And this is difficult to point with my laser pointer, but if you could look at the center of the picture, you can see a slope collapse. And so as the description says, the slope slid down to the bottom. And so this mudslide actually brought some debris onto the rail system. And so we saw so much sediment after this heavy rain, because the sediment was pushed down from the mountain slopes that came into the rail system, and also the rain washed down those sediment down to rail systems. Let's move on to the situation and also problems from different perspectives. It is very difficult to predict natural disasters. And however, even though we have some technological difficulties, we have some advancement. For example, bedrock collapse from weathering. This is very difficult to predict technologically. And also some sliding rocks from the mountain slopes. It is difficult to predict, to pinpoint one specific time point that may actually occur. However, for earthquakes, we have made much advancement because we have underwater seismic meters as a network. So we are able to detect P waves and then also S waves. As I mentioned earlier, in 2011, we were able to predict the big earthquake, and then we were able to stop all the fleet safely. And so we have a pretty good system for the earthquake prevention, earthquake readiness. And looking forward, we are looking forward to advancement of weather radars and also modeling technology to become more adequate to establish prediction systems. As I mentioned earlier, we are seeing flash floods or localized raining, meaning that we will be receiving a lot more external stress and also external stress onto our fleet and also infrastructure. Let's see this statistics. So this one is actually data from all the JR companies. And so this statistics is about rain disasters and JR rail system impact. And so you can see the data from 1966 to 2017. As I mentioned earlier, the Japanese rail system was privatized from the Japanese rail systems. From the 1960s, we have implemented inspections, meaning that we implemented this inspection to identify vulnerable or susceptible areas for disasters. However, we cannot eliminate all the impact from disasters, but we have been putting a lot of work toward preventative measures. And so you can see that some of the numbers are plateaued. And we are struggling to deal with heavier rains in recent years. And I think that will be one of the biggest challenges in the near future. And please look at this breakdown. This is damages caused by disasters and rainfall and also debris inflow and also embankment collapse. And so if you look at the left-hand side, this occupies more than 50%. And so let's move on to some of the damage examples caused by rain, heavy rains. And so this one is Typhoon Prepareathon. This is typhoon number 7 this year. This formed on June 29th and traveled north through the East China Sea to reach the Sea of Japan on July 4th. And due to the Pacific high, seasonal rain front remained near Hokkaido from July 2nd to 5th. So I'm just pointing out the actual map here, and then you can see the north part of Japan, which is Hokkaido, and you can see some of the movements by looking at the picture on your right hand side. So the front is stagnant around this time, and toward the end of this typhoon, it brought a lot of heavy rains.
And then in terms of the total amount of rainfall, the left-hand side is the rainfall amount, and the right side shows how much the ratio of the precipitation during the disaster. So if you look at the, there's a place called Shikoku. It had 1,800 millimeters, and this is about 400 times larger of the amount of, compared with the average year. And for Railwell, that definitely had some impact and did have wide area of impact. And the JR itself had about 32 areas or routes that had to suspend its operation. So they are these are the typical images of the disasters alongside the rivers. There were flooding. There were sediments flow from the slope. But at this time, 1 or 2 days prior to this disaster, the railway system actually suspended its operation. Therefore, there was no passenger fatalities related to the disasters. However, the facilities themselves did receive a large-scale damage. Therefore, the reconstruction effort did take a lot of time, and in much parts of the facilities are still undergoing reconstructions. Therefore, from our perspective, our first priority is to protect the people's lives, but also we also must bring back the operation as quickly as possible. So allow me to talk about the maintenance management. I know I am running out of time, so allow me to go faster. First, let's look at number 1, inspection. Of course, we will look at dangerous parts. And number 2 is to invest in prevention. These are the components of facilities maintenance. But there are other aspects that are not being able to protect it, and which is to say trade operation control, and also and number 4, detection. So in other words, if an accident does occur, we will make sure that any phenomena will not collide with the tracks or railway. So what kind of priorities we're thinking about? This allow me to speak about this. First of all, we call it countermeasures. So first of all, we will directly protect the danger zones, and then in Japan, there are limited areas where we can protect in terms of railway tracks because these slopes and then mountains, they're owned by different people, so different parties. So it is really, we do have a limitation as far as where and how we can protect. So if the sediments or rocks or any obstacles comes into the railway tracks, to detect that flow is something of a priority for us, and that is a measure that we take. And next is the in terms of amount of rainfall, there we use something called rain gauge, and we have this in around 10 to 15 kilometer intervals. And then in terms of the rainfall indices, first of all, we look at hourly rainfall. We also look at the continuous rainfall, and we also look at the accumulative rainfall. So there are the 3 big indices, the 3 top indices. But some of the railroad companies also, based on their experience, they look at the rainfall that goes into the soil. So they gauge the soil moisture, and they come up with what's called an effective rainfall. So again, some companies do use this type of index. And how do we combine these indices? So the vertical axis is hourly rainfall, and the horizontal axis is continuous rainfall. So this is based on the past data. We look at when and how the disaster took place, and then we use this kind of phases to show, and then we change this according to the data that we receive. And then then we use set the standard line, and then as far as how we will look at the trend, this shows the rainfall over time. And then this table shows from 1975 to 2017, and then we measure twice a year or so, and which showed that the trend is going upwards. And so this is a scenario that we used, and even separate from this data, we have found that the short-term rainfall has increased. In other words, the past experience really has not become that effective to us anymore. So what to do? here, this slide shows the weather phenomena. So there's a timeline or time scale, and then we also look at the horizontal spatial scale. And so, for example, the circle, blue circle in the middle, the cluster, rather, the front cloud cluster, this is detected through regular weather forecast. And as far as hurricane and others, this is something that we can suspend operations beforehand. However, in terms of the consensus from the community, this is not too easy to do. And so therefore, we must think about how to gain understanding from the community. And then on the other hand, on the left-hand side, we're looking at the localized heavy rains. These are the type of things that we are paying attention to for our R&D. And other entities are also cooperating with us. And then there's a multi-parameter phased array. A weather radar is something that has been developed recently, and we are conducting R&D. And the yellow frame is what we are conducting right now. So every 10 minutes, we look at the precipitation data, and then we make that into a map. And then the rain gauge, which is set 10 kilometers interval, we look at the data from that. And then as far as big scale water damages, the country itself will look out. So our job is to look at more of a small scale flooding or inundation. And we predict the disaster level of that. And we also look at the runoff and others. And then we also eventually look at deep-seated landslide analysis, and then look at the train operational analysis. And then we looked at 10, 20 minutes, and then so 10 minutes really maximum is the forecasting and frequency of, the frequency of forecasting. And then in the end, the rain data itself will be used in this manner. So the rainfall prediction, the rain data resource is a rain gauge, and then the data area is from the points, various points into space. And then the observation value and the control value are used to make a decision about suspending and the resumption of the operation. So we are using these type of data, and we are continuously changing the way that we operate our prediction as well. That is all for me.
Thank you.